In this tutorial, I'll be showing you how to easily mix and place color so that you get an accurate recreation of a rich skin tone. Let's begin. First, let's start off looking at our reference photo. The key to having a great painting and an accurate painting is by always looking back at your reference. In this photo, the male model has a very rich skin tone. Notice where the light source is coming from. The light source is hitting the right side of his face and casting the left side of his face in shadow. The darkest part, take note of the darkest parts of his skin. The left side of his neck, which is being cast in shadow because of the collar of his jacket. The inner corners of his eyes, the shadow being cast by his nose within his nostrils, the corners of his mouth, the shells of his ear, and also right underneath his bottom lip. I noticed that his neck is way warmer than his face. He has more yellow in his neck and more red in his face. Yellow is a very warm tone, and red is quite cool. Now that we've noted some things about our reference, we can begin painting. I'll be making other important observations to you throughout the video. The first color we'll be mixing is ultramarine blue and burnt umber. This will give us a nice dark black, but it won't be too dark. This way, if we want to go in with a lighter color, it'll be easy to lighten it up and it won't be too drastic or too dark. I'll be placing down this color underneath his eyelid, his bottom eyelid, on both sides. And I'll be using a synthetic round brush. I'm also going to be placing that same color at the opening of both nostrils. I'm placing this burnt umber and ultramarine mixture underneath his eyes because his eyes are quite rounded and they also kind of protrude from his skull. So that creates a shadow that makes his bottom lid look slightly dark. And it also gives definition to the shape of his eye. I decided to use the mixture ultramarine blue and burnt umber because it's quite a neutral color. Burnt umber is more on the warm side and ultramarine blue is more on the cool side. So this creates a balance for his shadow area. And that way, if we need to go in with more warm tones, we can do that without taking away from the shadow. Here I'm adding the ultramarine blue and burnt umber mixture to his lash line because I don't want to create anything too starkly black too soon. At this point in the portrait, I've outlined his crease line with ultramarine blue and the burnt umber mixture, and now I'm just going to place that also within the crease between the bridge of his nose and his eyelid, just to help blend out that. At this point, I've dragged that transition shade up and into the brow bone. Here I'm just going to put it in the shell of his ears to create that depth, that 3-dimensional look, and also into the folds of his ear. Since the left side of his face is darker than the right side, I'll be adding more deeper tones to that side. I'm also placing a mixture of burnt umber and red ochre underneath his eyelids. At this point, I'm applying the ultramarine blue and burnt umber mixture to his lower lash line. At this point in the portrait, I have mixed yellow ochre, red ochre, and burnt umber. This will create a more reddish, warm tone. I'll be placing that in the top inner corner of his eye and above his top eyelid, above his crease, and below his brow bone. I'm also going to be placing that color in the middle of his forehead. Here I'm going to place the yellow ochre, burnt umber, and red ochre mixture into the crease of his ear, just to give it some warmth. This is because the light is hitting him from the right, and when the light hits the shell of the ear, since the ear is very thin, it shows the how translucent the skin is, and you can see the blood underneath the skin, and that makes this reddish tone. As I paint, I'm making sure to pay close attention to my subject in my reference photo. And I'm going in and using that same mixture to paint a line on the side of his nose and down the bridge of his nose. Here I'm adding more warmth underneath the eyes with that same mixture and placing it wherever I feel it needs to go. Placing a little bit on the top of the eyelid in the middle. Blending it in a little bit. I apologize for the shaky part of this video. I was trying to find the perfect angle so you guys could see exactly what I was doing. Here I'm just warming up his top lash line with that yellow ochre, burnt umber, and red ochre mixture. At this stage I'm doing pretty much the same thing that I did on the right side of his face. Just adding that mixture to the middle of his eyelid, his brow bone, and the inner corner. But I'm covering more of that eyelid because it's much darker on the left side of his face. So that side of his face will be cast in shadow. Here I'm just placing that mixture also around his nostril, just as a transition color. Now what I've done is mix burnt umber, crimson, ultramarine blue, and titanium white to give me a nice cool purple color. Now this is going to be a highlight shade, and I'm going to place that above and below his right eyelid. And I'm going to do something similar for the left side of his face, but I'm just going to darken it a little bit more with burnt umber and ultramarine blue. And you see that I'm just blending that in. For the inner section of his eyelid, I'm mixing burnt umber, titanium white, and ultramarine blue to give me more of a bluish, cooler purple, a darker purple. Here I'm just using that mixture to blend out that mid-tone color and also to place above his cheek and right below his eyelid. Here I've just added a little bit more titanium white to the burnt umber, titanium white, and ultramarine blue mixture, just to make the right side of his nose look a little brighter. Later on in the video, I'll be adding straight titanium white without any other color added to it to give it a really stark highlight. I'm adding that same tone to the top section of his nose, closer to his right eye. And again, right underneath his eyelid. Paying very close attention to the highlights on his face and the lighting overall. And these, where the highlights are all high points of his face. Now I'm placing that same mixture, just with a little more titanium white mixed in, on the edge of his eyelid, underneath his eyelid, and anywhere I see fit where the light is hitting him at the most. Now for the left side of his eyelid, on the left side of his face, I will be adding burnt umber, ultramarine blue, and titanium white, and making the mixture have a little bit more blue because this side of his face is much darker than the right. And again, I'm just adding that below the brow bone, below the crease, and at the edge of his eyelid. And a little bit on his tear duct, on his lash line, and anywhere else where the light is hitting him the most. Here I've just made sure to lighten the color by going in with the previous mixture, which was the ultramarine blue plus titanium white plus crimson plus burnt umber, and that'll give it more of a purpley tone. Here I've added the mixture crimson, yellow ochre, and burnt umber to the left side of his ear, and then I'm adding crimson plus yellow ochre as a transition shade to the tragus part of his ear. And I'm just going to add that yellow ochre and crimson mixture to parts of his face where it's needed. Here I'm going in with the mixture yellow ochre, burnt umber, and crimson behind the crease of his right nostril and underneath his nostril and anywhere else I think needs that warmth, that lighter, warmer tone. Here I've added that yellow ochre and crimson mixture to the tip of the nose. To create the darkest part of the neck, I used a mixture of burnt umber and ultramarine blue. And to transition from that shade, I created a mixture of burnt umber and crimson. Now I'm going in with the burnt umber, crimson, and yellow ochre mixture to blend that out. Now I'm going in with a mixture of burnt umber, yellow ochre, titanium white, and crimson. Here I'm using a mixture of burnt umber and ultramarine blue to add in the contours of his throat and alongside his Adam's apple. Here I'm using crimson, red ochre, and titanium white to go on the lightest part of his neck. And a little after this, I'll be adding a little bit more titanium white just to make some parts even lighter. And then I'll just be adding plain titanium white to serve as the stark white highlight on his Adam's apple and on the very right corner of his neck. Here I go in with a little bit of crimson, yellow ochre, and burnt umber. And then I add a little bit more yellow ochre to that mixture. And I add it to the top of his forehead on the right and a little above his brow bone. Here I'm adding burnt umber, crimson, ultramarine blue, and titanium white to the middle of his forehead above where I added that yellow ochre, red ochre, and burnt umber mixture. Then after I do that, I'm going to be mixing burnt umber, ultramarine blue, and titanium white, and adding that on the opposite side, on the left side of that. Here I'm going to be adding crimson, burnt umber, ultramarine blue, and white to give me a cool grayish tone. And I'll be adding that right along his left cheek because that part of his face is in shadow. And right now I'm just blocking in his face and the color. Really bringing in the shape. Going in with burnt umber, ultramarine blue, and titanium white, it's going to highlight certain areas. And then I'll switch back to burnt umber and ultramarine blue, and I'll just darken up some key areas like the shadow right underneath his eye. And just darken up the nostril and the sides of his nose. Here I'm adding yellow ochre plus burnt umber along the bridge of his nose and underneath his bottom lip, his ear, and anywhere else I see that that color needs to go. Now I'm bringing in some yellow ochre, burnt umber, red ochre, and titanium white. Just putting that along the bridge of his nose, really trying to blend that out because the highlight's kind of transitioning from that really white highlight into the midtones. And then I'm adding crimson, red ochre, and titanium white, and adding and blending that out into the lighter color in the corner of his eye and on his earlobe. Now I'm going to be adding yellow ochre, red ochre, crimson, and burnt umber. I'm just going to be adding that in the shadows of his face, underneath his nose, underneath his lip, bottom lip, the left side of his jaw where his facial hair is, and where his underneath the highlight of his cheekbone. underneath where his cheekbone protrudes, and underneath his, around his jawline. Here I'm going in with burnt umber crimson, ultramarine blue, and titanium white. And then after that, I'll be going back in with some burnt umber, ultramarine blue, and titanium white. And I'll be switching back and forth between the two mixtures and adding more white where I feel like those colors need to be a little brighter. And as I go along, I'll be blending those shades into the colors around them. Now I'm adding some crimson, red ochre, and titanium white to the forehead and just around his face. Here I'm going in with burnt umber, titanium white, and ultramarine blue. And I'll just be adding more white to that the closer I get to those really bright highlights on his forehead. Here I'm going in with crimson, ultramarine blue, burnt umber, and titanium white. And I'm adding a lot of white to that because this side of his face is quite bright, much brighter than the left side. So I'm adding that above his eyelid and along the right side of his face. Here I'm just going to darken that burnt umber, crimson, ultramarine blue, and titanium white mixture and add that along his sideburns and along his jaw. Again, I'm just using a lot of white mixed into that ultramarine blue, crimson, and burnt umber and titanium white mixture. And just going around the contours of his lips and in the highlighted areas of his lips. I'm just adding some ultramarine blue and burnt umber just to darken up the outline of his Cupid's bow. Above his Cupid's bow, I'll be adding crimson, red ochre, and titanium white, just to warm up that area a little bit. And then I'll be going over that with yellow ochre, red ochre, and crimson and burnt umber right underneath his mustache. I'll also be adding that around the crease of his right nostril, and I'll be adding a little bit of detail on his right cheekbone. Here I'm just going in with black, and the paint that I use is lamp black, L-A-M-P, black. And I'll be going in to the inner corners on both sides, below his bottom lip, just to deepen that shadow more. And since the paint is still wet in these areas, it won't look too dark because it'll be blending nicely with what I previously added. And I'm also putting that black around his Cupid's bow area, just to deepen that again, just to define it more, define the shape of his lips more. Now I'm going in with some crimson, red ochre, and titanium white. And I'm just going to be blending a tiny bit of that into these areas. Here I'm just blending in a tiny bit of yellow ochre, red ochre, crimson, and burnt umber. Blending that into the highlighted areas. And that really defines the white parts of his face. I'm also using burnt umber, crimson, ultramarine blue, and titanium white again on the right side of his face. And here you just see me blending his hairline into his skin. And I'm using black, and I'm also switching between black and burnt umber and ultramarine blue. And I just want to say thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.